IVM.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Siddharth Bhatia. Afghanistan, which till the other day had thousands of American troops, has fallen to the Taliban. The swift manner in which the Taliban occupied Kabul, with the army offering almost no resistance, has shocked everyone. The Taliban says it has changed and will not revert to its old ways, but not everyone is convinced. Ordinary citizens are scared and trying to get out of the country, and the biggest impact likely to be on the women, who will have restrictions imposed on them, including the compulsory wearing of the burqa and hiding the face. Our guest today is Taran Khan, an Indian journalist and author who recently wrote the book Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. Khan went there several times between 2006 and 2013, staying there for several weeks or months at a time. And we'll hear her experiences, we'll hear her perceptions, and her book now suddenly becomes extremely relevant. It's a good book, by the way, you must read it. Welcome to the Wire Talks, Taran Khan.
Thank you, Siddharth, and thank you so much for having me on this podcast.
So tell me a little bit of the background. What took you there?
I first went to Kabul in 2006. I went with my husband and another friend, and we were on an assignment to work with media producers in a government-run TV and radio production house in Kabul. And we were there for a few months, and we really enjoyed our time there a lot. I think this was mostly because we were lucky enough to work with ordinary Afghans, and we were also fortunate enough to be able to live in the company of Afghans. We didn't have to stay in a compound at that time. Kabul was relatively safe, and as an Indian woman, I found that I could venture out and connect with the city. That was quite, that was quite different, I felt, from the experience of women from other parts of the world. And the city felt quite familiar to me in a way that was, I think, connected to how I had always been told not to walk around for no reason at all in my own hometown in North India, for instance. And all of this combined created a relationship with Kabul that was quite compelling. It became one of the formative relationships of my life. And so after 2006, my husband and I, we kept trying to find ways to go back. And as you probably know, Afghan media at that time was booming. And we found opportunities to go between 2006 to 13 to work with different organizations, work with their employees, or to work with Afghan filmmakers. And I say that we went to train them, but actually I was learning a lot from every journey I made there. This is not just a platitude, because I think at that time there was this incredible energy in the city, particularly among the creative community there. And I experienced it more with filmmakers, but it was evident across a lot of fields, with artists, with filmmakers, with musicians. And there was this feeling of wanting to tell stories, of wanting to express themselves. And in fact, I found a really interesting energy there, that there were very few resources, but people were really committed to telling their stories, to making films with whatever they could, and which I found really inspiring. And that's why I think we were so interested, and we kept going back until 2013, which is essentially the arc of the book. From 2006 to 13 is where it ends.
So did you find the Afghans receptive to what you were teaching? I know that they were interested in telling their stories, but were they receptive to what you were teaching?
I mean, essentially, we saw a role as supporting them in telling their stories. So, I think with me, there was this advantage that being from India, there was this tremendous sense of connection, particularly to Mumbai cinema, to popular Hindi cinema. which sort of immediately created a connection. Which is not to say that's the only kind of connection that people had to India, or even that was the only kind of connection to film, because there were extremely talented young filmmakers who had grown up in Iran as refugees and who had come to live in Kabul after 2001. And they were making really sort of edgy experimental films as well, documentaries and feature films. There were short films. There were also filmmakers who were making popular kind of, cinema, which was obviously more influenced by popular Hindi films. So I had a really, really good time working with them. I think partly because, like I said, it was an exchange. It wasn't just my sort of teaching them how to push buttons and so on, but it was an education for me, Siddharth, in terms of how you can actually find a way to do, if you're really passionate about it, to do what you want to do. And I've written about it. I've sort of, it's been one of the most important relationships in my life, simply as a source of inspiration, I think, as well.
So you kept on going several times and finally till about 2013. That's a pretty long span, especially in Afghanistan, which most people deemed unsafe or wondered what it was all about with all those guns around, etc. Did you see Afghanistan, Kabul, the people, the atmosphere undergo shifts each time you went? And from 2006 cut to 2013, did you see any kind of shift in the country? Any positive, negative, optimistic, or feelings more and more scared? Anything?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to say that I can only speak about Kabul, which is quite different from the rest of the country, as we're seeing now also. But in Kabul, and this is what a large part of my book is about, from 2006 to 13, there was a definite shift in the physical terrain of the city, as well as its sort of emotional geography, if I can use that term. It was in 2006, like I said, it was relatively safe. It was still, of course, there were many variables, but relatively, it was safe to go out for me to sort of walk around on the streets. There were a lot of restaurants at that time where especially foreign workers would meet. And over time, I saw the city transform. It became much bigger. First of all, it sort of spread beyond its traditional limits, which was ringed by the mountains, but then it pushed through and it grew beyond that limit as well. There were more modern apartment houses, for instance. There were sharaks, which were sort of like gated communities where more affluent Afghans shifted and they had more security at the gates. There were also, of course, from, I would say, any time from 2009 onwards, with the security situation worsening, there was this sort of withdrawal by both the international community and by the Afghan government of going behind higher and higher security barricades, behind concrete barriers, behind sandbags. So, like I've written in the book, I would be walking through a familiar area and suddenly half the road would have vanished behind a massive concrete barrier. This was physically, you could see the sense of withdrawal from the city. And of course, as it became relatively unsafe, I was also not able to venture out so often, which is again.
What do you mean by relatively unsafe?
Over time, I mean, from 2006 to 9.
No. Was it like any other city, local crime or that kind of thing, or some kind of looming presence that something was around?
It was definitely a mix of many things. So I would say that there was always, Kabul became more and more the target for suicide attacks from 2006 onwards. There were more targeted attacks on, say, government facilities or even on civilian targets. But there was also more crime. Like you said, there were kidnappings of foreign workers and later of Afghans who worked with international agencies. So it was very much a toxic cauldron of reducing safety. But again, this was all stuff that I would notice on every trip, but there would also be a sense of not everything was one tone. So for instance, towards say 2011 or 13, I would also be invited to the homes of my colleagues who had managed to build themselves a house after years of living as refugees in, say, Pakistan or Iran, they'd managed to save enough money to build themselves a house in Kabul, and they would be really happy about it, and there would be a celebration for that. So there was a lot going on. It was never just one sort of feeling or emotion. Yeah, it was very complicated, as we can see now.
But never a sense, or was there a sense that this will not last?
I would say that there was a sense of transience, especially in 2013, which is when I was there last. And in 2014 was if you remember, the formal end of combat operations by ISAF, which is the NATO coalition in Afghanistan. At that time, I felt very clearly a sense of an ending of one kind of narrative arc, which was, I think, what I had encountered in the beginning was the sense of hope, of peace in 2006. And in 2013, a lot of people who I knew well, who I had worked closely with, were either in the process of leaving the country or they had already left the country. And there was a sense of insecurity. There was a sense that there was for many people, they felt that they had no future in Afghanistan any longer, or they felt that they would at some point have to explore avenues for leaving the country. Of course, it took, at that time, it felt like 2014 was when the military operations would end. It took much longer in that sense. But I did feel that sense very clearly on my last visit there in 2013. Of course, all of that we see in a much heightened way now.
And even during that period when the Taliban was nowhere inside the city, or there was still some security, the Americans were very much there, people with younger children, etc., had begun to migrate?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be able to put a date to it because it really depended on how people saw their lives. But in 2013 were the most conversations I had with friends or colleagues who had either started to look for ways to leave the country, not necessarily only people with young children, young men and women who were single or who wanted to build a life for themselves. Many of the filmmakers who I had worked with earlier either left in 2013 or a few years later. In fact, I did write about that. I wrote a long series from Germany where I met some of the people who I had known in Kabul, and I met them later as refugees in 2017. Obviously 2018, I can't recall correctly right now, but essentially several years later, where they were trying to rebuild their lives, to hold on to their identity as filmmakers, not just as refugees, and their struggle to sort of find identity for themselves beyond that of being a refugee in Europe, and also their sense of very conflicted emotions at what was going on in Afghanistan, at having managed to get away while in many cases their families were still there.
2006, the first phase of the Taliban, which was a really awful kind of this. Now, of course, they say they're going to change. We'll come to that a bit later. But 2006, what were Kabul's women like?
Kabul's women, it's hard to say one thing.
It's a general question, I understand. But let's say at least the younger professionals or younger women in general, because older women, I'm presuming, maybe practicing older ways nonetheless, whether there was any pressure or not. But were there women saying, I want to enter another world, modern world, shall we call it?
Yeah, so again, Kabul, quite different from the rest of the country. And in fact, interestingly, Siddharth, what you say about older women, so because the women I met initially were very much in the workplace, and they were women who had worked during the Civil War or before that, and they had memories of sort of the fag end of the Soviet era or the Soviet influenced era. They had worked during Najibullah's government, for example, and they were still working, and they remembered Kabul, from beyond from before the Taliban's government. And for them, it was simply, a sort of thank God we can go back to the way we were. And it wasn't entirely new for them in that sense. They were
which is running their lives, basically.
Which is going to work, which was taking public transport, which was, dressing there was this sort of I wouldn't say it was a dress code, but there was a certain chicness to the women in Kabul, which was, they all wore these really beautiful outfits, which were nicely matched, and their headscarves would be standing out, and they had these very nice looking boots for winter. So for me, coming from Mumbai, where you tend to sort of dress, especially in the media, you dress a little casually for work. I really like that sense of care in coming to work. So I wouldn't say it was so much of a generational thing.
No, but still, when I say generational means, let's say a young woman who was like 20 or 18, who had almost no memories of that period, of the pre-Soviet or Soviet period, or Najibullah, they must have been very small. 2006, 2008, if you're coming of age around that time when you're 18, your approach becomes different. And when I say older, I meant people, let's say 60 plus, 70 plus, etc. But anyway, let's leave that point, whether it's older or younger. But 18-year-olds, shall we say, or young professionals whom you were encountering, or women in the streets. And I presume by then, let's say a meeting place, a coffee shop or something may have opened. So were they connected with the world's culture, popular culture? Were they looking different?
Yeah, very much so. In fact, like I said, there was a sense of very chic Kabuli sort of girls who would, they would take care of their appearance. There would be this area in Sharinov where if you went in the evening, which is a modern shopping district, you could see all these nicely turned out young men and women walking around, enjoying the evening, enjoying being out. And I think it definitely depended on the experience of the women and the men who I met. For instance, there were young women who had grown up in Iran or Pakistan as refugees, and they were now back in Kabul. In many cases, they had never been to Kabul before, but it was a city that they thought of as home, or that their families thought of as home. So they were negotiating the city from scratch, and they were doing it in their own way, So there would be all sorts of experiences, and it was really wonderful to see how, despite this sort of narrative of modernity being brought to Afghanistan by the West or from outside, I think it was very much a negotiated path at least by the young women I saw working in the offices in Kabul. And, they would have office get-togethers, or they would commute to work together. Very often there would be an office transport that took them and drop them off in the evening. So there's all kinds of really interesting narratives going on. Of course, there was wonderful amounts of gossip and just the usual sort of warp and weft of life, of working life.
So normal in that sense, like any other city.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that I find so valuable and heartbreaking, and at the same time so important to keep repeating, that every time people would ask me when I was going to Kabul from 2006 to 13, and there would be the sense, very often in casual conversation, people would ask, well, you go to Kabul, what is it like there? And it was a sense that it couldn't be a city like a city that we could relate to, or that would have normal people doing normal things. There would either be these incredibly noble victims of suffering, or they would be just passive victims. Whereas actually, of course, what I encountered was a whole range of human experience, of emotions, and all the contradictions in between.
So brave new generation was growing up with the usual intergenerational issues about finding their identity in various ways, including finding their identity as professionals and as women of the world. And I concentrate on the women because, to me, always in any kind of culture, that's a kind of benchmark. And I'm not saying South Asian cultures, but this about women growing up feeling, all the emotions that you feel from 14 to 25 and all that kind of thing. And then looking to make a future. So that you think was happening?
Absolutely. And of course, it came with a lot of challenges. And, obviously, I think it's quite obvious, but I'll say it anyway, that everything I said doesn't mean to trivialize the very real challenges that women in Kabul went through to get an education, to be able to work. They were often many, many barriers to mobility, from their families, to structural, to the kind of patriarchal oppression that they faced. But yeah, I mean, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that they had like women, they had agency. It's hard to sort of put them in any box, which is obviously reductionist. And I would say that this generation, the generation of Afghans that came of age after 2001, were remarkable also in they had experienced change. They had experienced the possibility of life with peace. And they are often well educated. In many cases, of course, depending on social class, on mobility, they had the opportunity to even travel, say to Europe, or they went abroad to study and then came back with a commitment to building their own country, which I found obviously really noble and inspiring. But also, it wasn't unusual. You could see these young people everywhere. In fact, I'm told that after 2013, it was as the international community left Kabul, it became more and more common to see the areas of sort of like cafes or just places to hang out. And there were young Afghans there. And I did see this in 2013 more and more. And I think it's important to note that this is a generation that has displayed a tremendous commitment to trying to achieve peace. And they have a lot to gain from living under peaceful circumstances. And they've paid a great price for it as well. I mean, just a few months ago, there was this terrible attack on a girls' school in Kabul. A few months before that, there was a very bloody massacre in Kabul University. And the victims of these were just such bright, fine young men and women. And it's really, of course, it's heartbreaking to see this. But I think it's really important to note that the cost of this war has really been borne by Afghans, ordinary Afghans like this, and of course in the largest degree.
Did being a woman give you special insights? I felt so, but in real terms?
I mean, I would argue yes. I think.
For example, women opening up to you, or even men for that matter.
I think it was, for me, being a woman from India was very important in being able to connect to the city in the way I did. And of course, it made a difference in the sense that I could access the interiors of homes, or that I could speak to women alone. But these are things that any woman could do, a woman from anywhere in the world could do. I think as an Indian woman, I got a degree of warmth and connection that perhaps wouldn't be available to women from other parts of the world, or just that we talked about different things, or that we talked about things a little differently. Because Afghans or the Kabulis that I met felt a deep connection to Indian culture, and very often they would tell me this. They would say that, we have a lot in common with India. And they would tell me this like something that they thought that I wouldn't know of, but they felt and they valued. And I think this was really key in my writing about Kabul the way I did, before that being able to experience Kabul in the way I did. And part of the journey of writing this book was recognizing that it's not just the stuff that, say, Western journalists or Western men write about is worth writing. It's fine to sort of write about going to the bakery, to having a picnic with your friend. Of course, these are valuable images from a city, simply because they add a layer to it. And there is space for all kinds of stories about this city, about every city, of course. So for me, this was a personal sort of part of the journey of writing the book, where I realized that what I had access to, which I could potentially not have seen as reportage, for instance, or not have seen as war reportage, was actually very much a narrative of the city that was worth hearing.
We'll be right back after this short break.
$100. That's all it takes to begin your journey with Bitcoin and Ethereum. No, really. With CoinSwitch, you can start investing in over 100 cryptocurrencies with just 100 rupees. On top of that, there are zero charges for deposits and withdrawals, so you can trade, buy, sell, however and whenever you want. All of this, plus their extremely intuitive interface, makes CoinSwitch the perfect app for beginners in the crypto space. But don't take my word for it. Just download CoinSwitch for free and try it out for yourself. If you'd like more information on cryptocurrencies, tune into A Show About Crypto with me, Rohan Joshi, my new adventure on IVM Podcasts. CoinSwitch, kuch to badlega.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. Tell us about some one or two experiences where you found nooks and crannies. I know that you are very interested in city histories, city stories. You are a flaneur of many kinds, even here. In my days, it used to be called loafer, but anyway, it's tell us some serendipity that emerged in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many instances, but just off the top of my head, maybe because it's a rainy day today, I can remember just walking around the area, which I mentioned called Sharinau. And this was in earlier in my time. So there was still, NATO tanks were still on the streets. And I could see the tanks sort of roll past. And then behind it, I saw the cinema called Park Cinema, which unfortunately has now been demolished, and had this poster for one of the Bollywood films. I think it was one of those really full of male anger kind of Bollywood films. And there was a line of people waiting to get in. And that was this kind of moment where I just felt, oh, this is a city which feels really familiar again, because these kind of films, these kind of scenes I had seen back home in Aligarh, where I'm from, and you wouldn't really see women going to the cinema in the middle of the day there either. And I walked on from there, and there was this small little ice cream store that I went into. And on a tiny TV there, they were playing, at that time, it was very, very popular, the TV show, Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi. It was a super hit across Kabul at that time. And they were playing it on this very small little television. And there was this family of mother, children, father, all just raptly watching it while eating their ice cream. It's such a beautiful image. And for a variety of reasons, that I often keep thinking about that family and how it was such a human moment where they were just watching the story of a woman. It was dubbed in Dari, so I couldn't understand the dialogue too well, but I knew very well the tone and the pitch of that serial, and it was just such a moment of like, oh, I know this, but this is new. So yeah.
But clearly the best of Indian culture was reaching there.
Yes.
So a cliched question, but I think it's important to get something out on that. Was that also walking around, but did it turn into a little bit of a voyage of self-discovery, of new kind of thoughts completely? I know that you are well-traveled. I know even in India, you've been out there going to places, etc. But it's still a familiar country. And when you go abroad, you're still a kind of tourist. And this, I find, is something in between. You're going to a foreign country, but you're really going to a general culture which you're familiar with in terms of some values, in terms of the way the streets function. But was there any kind of special, this is an awful word, but I'm going to have to use it, self-discovery?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't think anyone has asked me this earlier. But like I said, I think a lot of the connection with Kabul was, like you said, that strange sense of familiarity, which is not quite connecting with the familiar. It's not exactly what we know, but it's a version of what we know. That's how it felt for many, many things. In my case, it was also the fact that my grandfather, my Nana, who's passed away now, but at that time when I would go to Kabul and I would come back, and he would always tell me stories that I didn't know of. And he knew it really well, although he had never been to Kabul. It was one of the cities that he just knew through books, through reading, through the immersion in the shared culture of our region. And he would just tell me stuff about the city or its history or some mention in literature that would change it for me, and I could relate to it differently. So it was this very real bridge that he built for me from his study in Aligarh. And he really was my guide in Kabul in many ways, just wandering through it or talking to people, because a lot of the book is also about just the stories of Kabulis from their memories or mythology or from literature or from poetry, which is a wonderful way of exploring a city, which I got mostly from my grandfather. At least that's how it began. That's how I began looking at Kabul in this way. And I think that was a really valuable gift, because it's not often that you think of Kabul as a city of literature, of writing, of poetry. It's not the first thing that comes up, certainly in the mainstream media, for casual observers of the city. But this is how he was able to present it to me. And this was how I could then deepen my relationship with it. And this was so valuable then, of course, in how people could talk to me about their city then as well. So if I could ask them questions, I got the answers that corresponded to that. So I think in that sense, it was self-discovery or discovery, in the sense that there are so many ways to connect to cities. And like I said, Kabul became a really important part of my life. It still is. I mean, what's happening today is so difficult, of course, for personal reasons. I have friends there. I have connections there, and also friends abroad who have family there. But the thought of the city transforming, its streets transforming, is deeply personal to me. So I would say it certainly changed me in a number of ways. And it changed how I relate to cities. It changed how I relate to knowledge. And it changed how I see my role as a journalist and as a writer, writing about places in the world as well.
You can't go back. You haven't been back since 2013. And unfortunately, now it'll be really, really difficult. So all these years, 7-8 years before the latest sudden transformation or emergence of a completely new kind of Kabul and Afghanistan, did you keep hearing things? And are you hearing things? Are you getting some kind of feedback or insights or news now?
Yeah, I mean, in a way.
Now and in the last few years.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like I said, since 2013 onwards, there was definitely this sense among certain people that they felt the need to leave the country, or that the security situation in Kabul was just not stable enough for them any longer. And I think it definitely changed. There were cycles over time, but in the last few months, I had many conversations with people there where they talked about how they were all exploring options to leave. This was especially true among people who had worked with international agencies, who felt they were more at risk. Of course, when it eventually happened, the speed with which it happened has blindsided a lot of people. Many people who I was speaking with now are worried because they don't even have passports. So this is the strange sort of combination that they are stuck in, where they sort of were anticipating this, but not anticipating that it would happen with this speed. And I think I have limited, conversation with people now, unfortunately, because I think over the last few days, the internet has become a problem. But based on what I hear, the big feeling is of uncertainty, Siddharth. It's just simply what I keep hearing when I reach out to people, is that we're okay for now. We don't know what will happen in the future. This is a sentiment I keep hearing over and over again. And of course, it's understandable. But it's also clear that, the city is clearly changing in a very, very deep way once again. I think it's too soon for us to be able to judge how this will go. But the feeling among Afghans is of just uncertainty, of anxiety over the future.
Were you shocked at the speed with which it happened?
I was very, maybe the last 2 days, it had become apparent that it would happen. But of course, the absolute, the sense of events unfolding in itself, in hindsight, is not surprising. But the rapidity of it is certainly something that I didn't anticipate. And again, from a distance, it's hard to get a sense of how different that was on the ground. But I think on the ground in Kabul, it was even harder for people.
And you think some of the worst fears that people have about Taliban, whether it's new or old, are going to be realized, especially, let's say, in the way they will impose their own set of rules on women, on people who work in certain professions. You think it's going to be back to the old ways?
It's genuinely hard for me to say because, I've written a book on Kabul, which doesn't make me an expert on the Taliban at all. But simply from the news, which I'm now watching like everyone else, and from the very contradictory kind of reports coming in, I am worried. I am very worried for my friends there. I am very worried about my women colleagues who used to go to work. I know at the moment they're not leaving the house. I know at the moment they're all not sure whether they will be able to get back to work. I think the big concern also is a humanitarian crisis that's looming. There's so many refugees, internally displaced people in Kabul right now. Shelter, food, all of this is going to be an issue. Again, this is stuff that seems reminiscent of previous times during the civil war, during the Taliban's government, when Kabul housed a huge number of internally displaced people, and they mostly lived in acute poverty. The city before wasn't perfect. There was a lot of inequality. There was a lot of crime. Like I said, there was a lot of corruption. And I think all these factors are going to play into the situation now as well. So it's not going to be like before simply because Kabul isn't like it was before. The Taliban isn't what it was like before. The people aren't what they were like before. But yeah, it is a worrying time. And I can only hope that, and so far we've managed to avoid the kind of violence that occurred during the civil war from 1992 to 96, which is when the city was divided into different militias and they were, battling each other with complete disregard for civilian life. There was an incredibly high amount of crime against women. So far, that scenario has not come to pass, which is something to be grateful for. But yeah, I am extremely concerned about the future of all my friends in the Kabul.
You've not heard from anybody
recently?
Yeah.
No, I am in touch with friends there, with colleagues there. And like I said, they're all just really worried about the future.
So again, the question arises, surely the women, their position is going to certainly immediately visibly change. I think from what I'm reading, and I don't want to, because I know what you read is one part of the whole, but from what I'm reading, they're talking about imposing Sharia law for women and wider way that their country will be run. Plus, there was this item, I don't know how true it is, of a woman anchor on television being asked to leave and somebody else taking over. So that kind of thing. Will women bear the brunt of the whole thing?
Women have always been incredibly vulnerable in this society, in many societies. I think in that sense, definitely, they are going to be vulnerable now as well. And in terms of the specific laws and so on, we'll just have to see. But again, Siddharth, I just want to remind you that this is something that predates even the first Taliban government. Like I said, during the civil war, during the Mujahideen government, there were similar, in fact, in many cases predating the Taliban, rules on women covering up, on cinema halls being closed and so on. So we shouldn't make the mistake of ascribing specific Taliban era laws to these situations, but of course not to reduce or to dismiss the fears of the current situation. But I do want to just remind you that these are things that have been around for much longer, even before 96, when the Taliban took over.
Yeah, so that small breath of optimism and hope, which you probably saw from 2006 for the next couple of years at least, I'm not talking about 2013, that small hope of let's work for the country, people coming back, that started fading for soon enough after a few years, and you saw a bit of that. So that's extinguished for the time being.
It was deeply compromised, like you said, even when I was there. I saw it was extremely complicated. There were so much corruption. There was so much, sort of nepotism with all that money coming in, and just all the opium
Naturally,
trade.
With so much money sloshing around.
I think again, like I just want to say that it's important to remember that. And unfortunately, we didn't remember this. One of the really heartbreaking situations about today is that we are once again talking about Afghanistan in crisis. And for the last many, many years, Afghans have been asking the world's media to pay attention. Journalists who live there, who work consistently there, have been trying to keep it relevant. It's just really difficult to not see this as part of the problem, because we are only focusing on this country, on the situation now when there is a huge crisis. It's not a crisis that it was invisible until 2 months ago. It's something that we decided not to pay attention to. When I say we, I mean the international media, I mean people as people. It was just something that we decided to, leave until it erupted once again. So I think these are things that we really should be thinking about and reflecting on, and definitely talking about as well while we are talking about Afghanistan today.
So even all those years, Afghanistan was pretty much left to its own devices.
Which is exactly what it was during the Civil War, which is when I often think of this video, Siddharth, I'd seen in the archives of the Red Cross, which was filmed in 1993, if I remember correctly. And it's this man standing on the street of Kabul. It was, I think, part of a raw footage or just a film being made about the humanitarian crisis again. And he's speaking with this sense of great urgency into the camera. And he's saying something like, please take our words to the United Nations. Tell the world that Afghans are suffering. And I so often think about that man and his words, because this has been a plea, a demand, a expression that has been going on for so long, for so many decades now. And yet it seems to be a silence that it's important for us to hold on to that silence. It's important for us to forget, because if we keep remembering, then we'll have to do something about it. I think there is a deliberateness to this forgetting, to this sort of refusal to pay consistent attention to Afghanistan.
That's unfortunately the nature of the beast now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, that the media pays attention to events and not processes. And unfortunately, that is this. And there those, I'm still sure they're around, but at one time, the Middle East, there were people who had become such experts that they kept on writing on various kind of things. And these things come in tides and, come and go. India was a great optimistic story 10, 12, 15 years ago, and covers in all the magazines. Then it became, just now, it's all about what a terrible place it's become.
Yeah.
And though personally, I think they're not getting even 100% of what's really going on. They are not getting the larger picture. I'm not talking about the Indian media, but the international media is not getting the larger picture of what's going on. And so many other things have happened. I'm not giving a lecture on the media, but budgets have been cut. The interest in the world outside has waned. So that unfortunately is true. But I fear that even when this crisis will, recede from memory within the next month or 2 months, unless there is a outburst of something, nobody will care anymore.
I think there's a big difference now that I would want to share right now, is that there are many young, or not just young, there are many Afghan journalists now who are doing a spectacular job of reporting for international media as well as for Afghan media. There are, of course, many non-Afghans who are doing a very good job of reporting, but I think this is really important. Who do we choose to listen to right now? And I would strongly encourage people to pay attention to Afghan voices. Of course, there's a space for non-Afghan voices, but also to to amplify, to listen to these men and women who are writing for many international outlets as well.
But will they not be at risk?
Siddharth, if you go to the Tulo TV website, they're still reporting, So I think along with all the media diet needs to include, these outlets as well, is what I'm trying to say. So, and also, the fact that there are so many international news agencies that depend on Afghan so-called fixers to do the jobs for them. I think it's high time we moved beyond these kind of terms and started giving them the bylines they deserve, the recognition, the protection that they deserve. So, yeah, like you said, these are all structural issues with the media. But
very much so. Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
So. Anyway, so my final question to you is, do you view the next few years with great trepidation?
I would say that I am certainly, at the moment, worried for the safety, for the security, and the future of my friends in Afghanistan. How things will turn out is anybody's guess. My biggest hope right now, like I said, is to avoid the kind of whole-scale violence of civil war. I think that would be truly devastating for Afghans, of course, for the region as well. Again, just for ordinary Afghans, it would be really, really devastating if we were in a situation like that. But I also want to say this, and at the risk of being a cliche within a cliche, is that so often you hear Afghanistan described as this graveyard of empires, and there's this whole narrative about how every foreign power has been defeated. And it's so counterproductive. It's such a problematic image that because every time I went to Kabul, Siddharth, the consistency with which I found Afghans wanting peace, willing to engage for peace, that is lost in this narrative. And I think it's really important to remember that even in this dark moment, that this is a generation, these are people who paid a very heavy price for peace. And we can only hope that in some way that will prevail.
Yeah, so let's end there, because obviously sitting here, we will not be able to come up with, and I don't want to indulge in speculation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Except just to get a sense of what someone like you who knows the place would think. But that's going to be everyone's hope. So on that note, thank you very much, Taran. And you've really given us some nice stories and memories and insights. I think now is an even better time to read your book. That's Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. And I hope for everyone's sake, Afghanistan turns out to be still a place of some hope for the future.
Thank you.
That was Taran Khan, a frequent visitor to Afghanistan and to Kabul during the peacetime. And it's all there in a book, as I just mentioned. And we will be back next week with another guest on the Wire Talks. Till then, goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On the first episode of Last Brand Standing, learn all about the intriguing battles between Tata Motors and Maruti Suzuki with hosts Anupam and Ambi, hosts of other shows on the IVM Podcast Network, Besa Vesa, and the Sponge Podcast. Great show that I think you'll really enjoy. We would also like to announce our collaboration with Hunts, India's most widely read literary magazine. Hunts Vani is now available in audio version on IVM Podcast. Do check it out. On Tere Mere Raste, Keshav tells us how people lived underground in Turkey's Keymakli city for generations. Varun introduces us to the world of audio advertising with Stas Tushinsky on Advertising is Dead. How can influencers shift from advertising to paid content? Siddharth Deshmukh tells us on Smarter with Sid. And on the Wire Talks, Siddharth talks to A.D. Singh about how badly restaurants are hit during the lockdown. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any other show for that matter, please do tell a friend. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Seat, Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quater, CoinSwitch, Kuber, and Intuit India. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.